Welcome to the fourth in the series of Old Neighborhoods. We're concentrating on Avenel this year. I started this project in 2008. I'm an outsider. I moved into Woodbridge. I did not grow up here, as so many of you have. And I was fascinated with Woodbridge because it's made up of 10 communities, but everybody is interwoven into this tapestry, no matter your ethnic background, religion, whatever. To me, Woodbridge has always been an amazing community. Yes, we're the oldest continuing township in the state of New Jersey, but to me, it's the residents, especially after World War II, that this place mushroomed. Woodbridge Township went from about 40,000 people to close to 100,000. Many of you experienced that change. And at the table right now, I have the kid over here. This is Joseph Frame Jr., who is the youngest of all of us. He grew up in one section of Avenel. Barbara Kuzniak-White grew up in another section of Avenel. In spite of how small Avenel is, only about 17,000 people now, we had sections. And then there's Ted Pachowski, who grew up in Avenel, and you were born on the Maple Tree Farm?
Correct, 1929.
Okay, so we've got a span, and this is the beauty of oral history. We're going to get their personal reactions, their personal stories. There's no right or wrong answer here. It's what these different people experienced, and they're going to share their memories with you. Then, if we have time, we should have time left over, I want you to share your memories as well. Some of you brought photos, some of you brought notebooks, some of you came in from Pennsylvania today just to be here. So I look forward to all of us sharing our memories and going down memory lane, reminiscing about what Avenel was like. The mayor just updated you on what Avenel will become, and as he said, the property values have already started going up already. So let me introduce our contestants. Joe Frame, Barbara Kuzniak-White, and Ted Pachowski all grew up in Avenel. Do they still live in Woodbridge? Ted had to go out and build his own home in Edison. But the rest all live in Woodbridge. So there's something good about Woodbridge. And each person here represents the diversity of this township, as well as their experiences. Okay, so the format is I'll ask a general question, and then we're going to rotate the answers. And we've got about 4 or 5 questions, and I just want them to share their memories with you. Then at the conclusion, if you have any questions, you ask them, and then there's light refreshments in the office later on for all of us to share. Okay, the first question I'm going to direct it, we'll start off with Joe. Why did your family settle in Avenel?
First of all, my father was from Newark and my mother was from East Orange, which were obviously pretty big cities. So they lived for a short period of time when they were first married in Kearney. And I can only guess why they chose Avenel. I think like many people of the post-war generation, they wanted the good life of suburbia after having grown up in cities. And also, from what I know of the post-war years, from what I've read and what I remember slightly, apparently housing in cities was in short supply, and a new development like the one we lived in, which was on Remsen Avenue in Avenel. And when I think of Avenel, I think of it as divided into 4 quadrants, so to speak. So we were on the west side of Route 1 and the north side of Avenel Street. And so the development that we lived in were affordable, especially for people like my dad who had served in World War II because they were eligible for the GI Bill. And I presume that is what drew them to Avenel, the affordability and the idea of living in the suburbs rather than the city. We did not have any relatives that lived in Avenel or Woodbridge. Many years later, a distant cousin moved to Avenel. I know that my parents looked at similar developments. I remember them telling me they looked at Hope Lawn and decided against it. And reflecting on, so obviously I've given some thought to this question, and reflecting on it, I can only speculate that they made Avenel their home because it had I'm going to give you a quote now from one of the people in the audience, Mr. Gary Intron, sitting toward the back there. And he says that Avenel had a privacy, a dignity, a stilled emotion, and a presence about it. So I think that may have been what led them to Avenel.
Wow. Okay, now we're going to go to my left. We're going to ask Barbara, who really didn't start off in Avenel. You started off on Strawberry Hill in 1930s, but by the late 30s you were in Avenel, correct?
Not until 43.
Not until 43. Okay, so
6.5
you're during the
years.
war. Joe was in the 1950s. That's why he's the kid. Okay, so we're into the war now. And why did your family move to Avenel? Why did they move to Woodbridge?
Well, we moved to Woodbridge because my grandparents,
Yes. Don't touch anything, just speak.
my grandfather immigrated from Hungary in the early 1900s and built a home on Strawberry Hill in Woodbridge, sent for my grandmother. At that point, she had 2 children, and they settled on Strawberry Hill. I assume because we had a cousin living in town. That's why they settled in Woodbridge. And then my mother was the first child born in America. She had 3 other sisters after her. And a very, very close family. When I was born, we lived in Strawberry Hill. It was a 2-family house. The upstairs had two rooms and a bath. That was it. That's when I came home from the hospital. And I assume we moved to Avenel to be close to the family in Woodbridge. When we moved into Avenel on Mines Street, where in the other quadrant, off Railway Avenue, it was farmland. We had 4 or 5 houses on the dirt road. It was during the war, 1943. And I just remember, can I tell about the war?
Yeah, and then we're going to go to Ted, though.
I remember air raids. I remember the sirens going off at Security Steel. And when those sirens went off, you heard them. And the first thing was you shut the lights off and drew the shades. And I remember I wasn't scared. It was just something we did. It was part of life. And then I remember when the war was over, the women on the street were crying, happy as can be. Everybody was out blowing the horns on their cars, and they were out with pots and pans and everything. And I thought, oh, this is great. The war is over. I mean, I knew the words, but at 6 years old, 6.5 when we moved there, and in the middle of the war, it was a way of life. And I never spoke to my parents why the reason they settled in Avenel, but I assumed to be closer to the family in Woodbridge, because every Sunday we would go back to my grandmother's house in Woodbridge with my aunts, my cousins, and that was a tradition for years and years and years. And after we were there, I was in the house on Mines Street until I got married. When we got married, we moved into an apartment on Yale Avenue in Avenel. We're there for 2.5 years, bought the house in Hope Lawn, and I've been in Hope Lawn since 1957.
Okay, but the war years
We're at Avenel.
The 40s. Now we're going to go to Ted, and just pass the mic to Ted. Ted, you relate why your family moved to Avenel, because that's a little different than everybody
I'm going to
else.
have to take you back to in the 20s, 1920s. 1920, my father had a dream. He wanted to have a picnic grove. he saved the money. He had a lucrative painting business at that time, painting carriages, horse and wagons, advertising and stuff like that. He had a very good business. And then he was trying to start looking for property for a picnic grove. And he found it in Avenel, New Jersey. And the reason for that is it had to be isolated, because if you have a picnic grove, you didn't want any problems with a neighbor. You had live bands, you had people talking, lights are on late at night, so you would have a problem with the neighborhood, which you didn't want to do. So at that time, in 1926, he took the money he had and he purchased the property. And at that time, it was called the White Star Bakery. The building was built in 1830, and at the same time, it was empty for quite a few years. And it was ideal for what my father was looking for, because it was isolated. He wouldn't have any problems from the neighborhood. It had access from Rowley Avenue, which was a good location for transportation. And at the same time, we were right next to the state prison. So what happened, everything was connected through the years between the state prison and actually Avenel. And what happened is, in 1930, or 26 first he bought the property. In 1930, he wanted to continue building his business, which would be a picnic grove. So he rented the property out. In 1930 and 31, he took the money and he went and bought himself, number one, a license. At that time, I think about 31,
You still had Prohibition back then.
Prohibition stopped about that time. So with Prohibition, he was able to get a license. At the same time, he wanted to build onto the property, which would be a dance hall. So with the money he got from renting the property, he was able to put up the dance hall, at the same time buy a tavern license in Jersey City. And he was there till about 1935. After 1 year of the rental on the White Star property, he gets a call from the agency that the people that rented the building and the property had to be gone. They had a mob warfare on a property in Avenel. So what happened, they said, we'll make good on the second year of the contract, but we have to leave because we are known where, in other words, they wanted to hide again on another piece of property. Because you got to remember, Avenel was really isolated at that time. I don't know how long they were been in that area, but it was isolated enough where they wouldn't be located until actually 1930. So what happened after that, he went to, see, what did I do? I just want to get in sync. Okay. So he built a dance hall with the money that he got from the rental. At the same time, he bought the license in Jersey City. In 1935, he decided to move the family from Jersey City to Avenel. And it became a family project of getting everything ready for what he wanted to do to build his picnic grove. So the rear of the house itself had the bakery. And at that it was a good structure. It was large enough for a dance hall. It had all facilities. So you had toilets in there, bathrooms. The only thing you had to do is paint and clean up. And you had a good building with no cost whatsoever. But you had to put a new floor in there for the dance hall. Okay. At the same time, he had enough money now to put in the dance hall, the second dance hall that was needed in the back. So now you had two dance halls. At the same time, with the family, everybody was pitching in, painting, cleaning up, and getting ready for actually the first day to open up on the picnic grove. At that time, it was very isolated. I don't think the neighbors were able to leave their house. Everything around here was dirt streets and everything like that. The families had no place to go. They had children. It was very hard. You had to look after them continuously. When Maple Tree opened, the first day he did was one of the worst, the best things I ever thought. He made little lapels, and they were white and red. He opened up on a Mother's Day, and as the neighbors came in, if your mother was living, you would get a red little buttonniere. If she was gone, they would have a white buttonniere. That gave the people that came in an option to talk to each other's neighbors. They never seen each other before. There was very little circulation at that time. And it happened that people started to talk to each other. The families were talking to each other. The children were playing with each other. The men was playing, talking about their businesses and so forth. And this became one of the social events that was on the Maple Tree. Each Sunday, they would have a different band, and people loved to dance at that side. I don't care who had the picnic, everybody came to the picnic to dance. The churches at that time were involved because they were making money, because people were coming in. You didn't have to belong to the church. You wanted to dance, they had a band. Every Sunday there was some kind of a band, and everybody was just happy. This is where the good times started in Avenel, a social area to come to the weekends that people were looking for all their life. They were ready to, they had their families. They could come to the picnic, the children could play, they had baseball, they had horseshoes, they had all different entertainment for the children. The mothers would talk with the neighbors, the fathers would talk with the neighbors. They got to be very good friends. The churches got involved because now the association was between all people, not just the church themselves. So what happened, it got to a point where people could not wait till Sunday, believe it or not, to come to the picnic. And today, if you see or hear somebody that's been at the picnic during that time, you could see the memories that people carry all these years because of the opportunity they had to come together in a town that was isolated, and it was really, there wasn't anything in there around, there was nothing there. Actually, it was isolated. Everything was so isolated.
I'm just going to interject here because this was the social center for a
Correct.
long time. But I also want to mention, and you hinted at it, that the reason it was White Star?
Yes.
All right. Then it became Maple Tree in the 1930s because of its location next to the prison. This was very important. The prison had water. And Maple Tree was one of the few places that had two wells at the time because you were on the same side as the prison.
Right.
And we take it for granted now. The reason the program has the background here, it is of the prison. Because of that, housing, it was a reformatory at first, but they needed electricity. They needed water. They had to have sewers. As a result, that bakery and then the Maple Tree Farm was able to function there. But everything else was woods, basically.
Yes.
You come later to Avenel in the 40s. Ted's back in 1929. And I'm going to add on to that. I'm going to go to you, Barbara, because you have memories of the Maple Tree, the dancing pavilions.
Myself and every adolescent growing up in Avenel at the time like Ted said, every Sunday they had picnics there and the music. And I have to fess up, we would sneak into that maple tree farm every week.
I knew it was
through
coming.
Ingenious ways. And I would go into the building, go into the ladies' room, then nonchalantly come out of the ladies' room and go on to the Grove. I was talking to my girlfriend years later, and she says, "You did that? I used to climb out the bathroom window." And it was great. We did a lot of walking. We walked all over, and wherever we were in Avenel, we walked the maple tree every Sunday. There was an Irish group there. We did the Irish dances. If there was an Italian, we danced. There were Hungarian, whatever. We were there. And I know the family knew that we were sneaking in. And I thank Ted when I first met him now, because we really, really enjoyed our vacations and, well, our dancing. To this day, I love to dance, and it started at Maple Tree.
Okay, but did you know that she snuck in?
No, I never knew that.
not
I didn't
until
know they
I
See,
owned
this is
that.
where interviews come in
It
handy.
wasn't only me. It wasn't only
It wasn't
me.
only you.
No.
Okay. Can you hear now? No. You can't? It's on? Oh, let's see. Joe, you're the expert because you entertain here.
2, 1, 1, 2.
That's on.
All close.
Okay, thank you. All right, now we're going to Joe. He's much younger. The 1950s he moves to Avenel. Maple Tree, and it's after the war. So his experiences for recreation, his childhood experiences, are somewhat different. Joe?
I never went to the Maple Tree Tavern, and I kind of wonder now why I never did. Seems like I missed something. So my childhood experiences were sort of, I guess, similar to almost all of the kids that grew up in Avenel. And Brenda mentioned this in her introduction, how everybody was the same. You know, and when I put my notes together here, I have it in bold print. I'm saying here, playing all day with neighborhood friends, all of whom lived on the same street and feeling no different from anyone else. Everybody was exactly the same. Almost everyone on Remsen Avenue, where I grew up, was from Newark, Elizabeth, or Jersey City. So that's a little bit perhaps different from their experience, where people grew up, you know, were either born in Avenel or grew up from a young age in Avenel. Although I don't remember living in Kearney, as I said earlier, I lived in Avenel. I can only remember living in Avenel. All of the kids that I played with had parents that were from one of those cities. Most families had a father who worked during the day and a mother who was a homemaker, a housewife. And any mother was capable of caring for you or telling you to stop doing that, and you had to stop doing that. And they were all respected. Brenda and I talked about this briefly before the program started, how children had respect for all adults at that point in time. I remember spending full days, all day long, in quote-unquote the woods, what we refer to as the woods. And so you guys have a different understanding of the woods because you were on the other side of Route 1. On my side of Route 1, the woods were what are now, I don't really know the name of the apartments, but there's a huge apartment complex along Leesville Avenue, and it goes all the way down to Rowway, to the scrapyards. That was all wooded area, and we would go in there in the morning when we went out to play. We'd be in the woods the whole time, and many times we would build forts, we would play army, and occasionally a pheasant would startle a pheasant and they'd go flapping off. So right in Avenel. And there were some people that said foxes lived in the woods. I never saw one, so I can't say that for sure, but I'm pretty sure the people that told me weren't making it up. The woods also included the area where Avenel Middle School and School 23, both of which I attended, are now located, and it was interesting topography down there. The land, I kind of think that maybe the people that built the development where I lived in used the topsoil from that area to finish off our property, because I have a distinct recollection of the land being just shale. No topsoil, no vegetation, just red clay shale with these little gullies which would all sort of run down into a stream or a creek, if you want to call it that. And the creek ran from where Woodbine Gardens is now. It ran all the way all the way across the cricket fields in Avenel Middle and into went under Woodbine Avenue and continued through to the roadway to the Sucker. I guess it's Sucker Brook that comes through from Merrill Park and all, and then this little creek would hook up with Sucker Brook and then the Rollway River.
And then you had flooding.
Sledding?
Flooding.
Oh, flooding. We had some flooding in our part of. We were kind of like at the bottom of the hill. We had some flooding, but none of the houses where I lived had cellars, so there were no basements, and I think that may have been why, because of the flooding.
Okay.
Yeah. Another memory I have is sledding down the hill on Remsen Avenue when the snow was packed hard on the street, and this is before roadways had to be salted so that only pavement was visible, as it is now. And we would, as kids, we would ride down Remsen Avenue all day long. Never have to worry about getting hit by a car, because there weren't many cars during the day, because the people that had the cars were the dads, and the dads were at work. I used to ride my bicycle all over the place, which I have in my notes here in quotes, all over the place, because all over the place was strictly limited by Avenel Street, St. George Avenue, and Route 1. You couldn't cross those streets. That was like illegal. You couldn't do that. You had to stay in your quadrant as a kid, you know. And that pretty much finishes up what I remember. Oh, one other major thing that I do remember growing up in our little neighborhood in Avenel was, because it was a development, I think that the builders sort of bulldozed the trees and everything and then built the houses, because I could look out my front door, look to the left, I could see all the way up the street, and look to the right, and I could see all the way down the street, and there was nothing in the way to impede my vision in any way. I also remember another remarkable experience of childhood was getting a dial telephone, and we went from Woodbridge 8 to Mercury 4. Because I can remember as a kid, and you guys can probably recall, obviously, that you'd have to tell the operator what number you wanted. So, thank you.
Did you have party lines too?
Oh, yes. We had a party.
Yes. So you couldn't talk long on the phone?
Nope.
Okay, we're going to go to Ted, then we're going to go back to Barbara about childhood experiences. Ted, in your interview, you mentioned about you were 10 years old and you discovered something.
Oh.
That's interesting.
Let me go back just to the time that they had the warfare with the mafia in there at that time. I was 14 years old, and I heard these stories since I was born, of the mafia. And who do you ask? There's nobody around. I was very curious at that time. On the property, they had a 3-story barn from the bakery time where they had 6 horses that pulled the wagons. They had I would say a garage. I don't know what there was no doors on it. I couldn't figure out when I was a youngster why they never put a door on. Then I recalled that they used to back the bakery wagons in the stalls, and that's what they were. So I was curious, and I said, I have to find out if it's true or not, if they had any warfare on here. So I took a ladder, I went up on the beams, and I started to feel along the beams, got a blackjack. Walked along the beams, got a revolver. I said, 1 and 1 was 2. Here it was. It's true, the stories I heard. They did have a mafia fight at that time in the 30s. All right? So what I'm going to tell you about is the maple tree was attached to the state prison property. Every morning that I got up, you would see 40 cows being driven in the open fields around Avenel with one of the prisoners. All right? 4 o'clock, they would be driven back to the state prison. This went on 6 days a week. The 7th day, they stayed in the prison. When spring came, they would till the ground. This is the state prison now, from Rowley Avenue all the way to the railroad, and grow corn. When fall came, you had a sea of corn from Rowley Avenue all the way to the Pennsylvania Railroad. Then you'd have Klondike horses coming from the state prison, taking the corn back to the state prison. After the corn was gone, hunting season would start. If you wanted to hunt, you had to come to Avenel. You had rabbits, you had pheasants. Across the street from the state prison was called Duck Pond at that time. You had to vote to get the ducks, but it was there. And they had geese eventually that would come once in a while. But basically hunting was 100%. You could get what you want on hunting there at that time. And this is what happened is the pastures had patches of, don't forget, you're in areas that is going back maybe 100 years. When you had blackberry fields, you could take a pail. You could go over there and pick up a pail of blackberries, bring it home, and you could make the pies. Anything like that grew out there. We had wild apple trees, wild pear trees. You'd take the pears, put them in glass jars, and then preserve them through the winter so you could have something to eat in winter. We even had a tree that was, I would say, 50 feet tall. It was called tea tree. It was very narrow feathers on these things. If anybody was sick, I mean really pneumonia or anything like that, they would cook these tea leaves, and believe it or not, you would sweat. And when you sweat, the fever was gone. And this is why you had to go back that many years. We had no refrigeration. Underneath was a underground room with shelves that kept everything in jars. All your meats and everything had to be kept below ground. And people survived all these years because I was asking my wife what was the temperature at that time. And I heard years ago, the temperature below the ground, you were able to do this. And they had to do it because here was one of them that would be exposed to what you had at that time. So it made a big difference as far as living at that time. What did you do with yourself? If you went near the state prison, believe it or not, the state prison had mushrooms. I don't know what they're called today. They were 4 inches in diameter, 1 inch thick. And they grew under a little bush about as high as this table. You would take it and string them, dry them, and you'd have mushroom soup for the whole year. Just from, I don't even know what they call those mushrooms.
Okay, but let me have the phone. We also want to mention that your mother and father were immigrated from Poland, right? And Eastern Europeans are very famous, and Hungarians, mushroom hunting. And so your dad would know, plus you had all those cows there fertilizing. So that may have had some impact too. But thank you. Barbara, how about your childhood experiences? You mentioned the end of World War II, but you also did a lot of sleigh riding as well.
For you people familiar with Avenel, lived on Minzer Street, the first block from Rowley Avenue. And from Manhattan Avenue, there was the best hill on Minzer Street for sleigh riding. Minzer. And we would cart our sleds up to Manhattan and start running, get a belly flop, and come down that hill. It was great. And I was an only child for 9 years, and then I had a sister when I was 9 years old and a sister when I was 10 years old. To tell the story, I took one of my sisters, I had her on the sleigh with me, and it was an exceptionally good packed snow. And we started on Manhattan Avenue and came all the way down Mines Street, crossed Commercial Avenue, past my house on Mines Street, and my mother happened to be standing in the doorway and saw me coming on that sled with my baby sister. And that was my end of taking my sister on the sled. And at night, my mother would come out and also go sleigh riding. I mean, she wouldn't come out in the daytime, but at night. And it was the best hill on Mines Street from Manhattan Avenue.
Okay, do you have any other memories? Because you mentioned something about the president, FDR.
Oh, yes. Yeah, like Ted said, the neighborhood was great. Everybody watched out for everybody else. Everybody knew everybody. And when Delano Roosevelt died, all the women on the block, my mother and the other ladies, were on the street talking and crying. And they were really, really emotional about his passing. And I was young, and I thought, well, gee, you know.
Can you speak a little louder, please?
It's just a man, but the fact that they were so emotional at FDR's death, I said he must have been somebody special, because they all took it personally. And this was the neighborhood. Everybody just grouped together, and everybody had the same feelings, the same emotions, and it was a great way to grow up because you know that everybody was looking out for you. And like Ted said, we respected everybody.
Okay, you and Joe both had a neighborhood. Ted was a little bit isolated on the farm.
I meant Joe, sorry.
He had the unique experience with the farm in Avenel. Let's go to covering these years, the 30s to the 50s. This was question 3 that we had. What do you consider the focal points of your life in Avenel at that time? We're going to start with you, Barb. Back to you.
All right, with me it was church, St. Andrews, the school, number 5, and the neighborhood, and first of all, the family. But we were very involved in the library. We spent a lot of time in the library, which was on Avenel Street next to the school, tiny little place. But the focal point really was the church and school.
Okay. Joe, for you, growing up in the 50s.
Okay, well, growing up in the 50s, as I said, I made notes ahead of time, so I'm going to show this to Brenda, the very first thing I have. So I'm not making this up. First thing I have in my notes is the church, St. Andrews in Avenel. My parents were devout Catholics, and we went to Mass every week and on holidays. And because St. Andrews didn't have a school, I also went to CCD. I'm pretty sure you probably did that, right? And we were, during the summer, we even went to a summertime religious school. So it was really important to our family and many other families, obviously, in Avenel. Both schools, school year, during the school year, the CCD and the summertime religious schools were taught by Sisters of Mercy who came from St. James Church right here in Woodbridge. And I have to say that people hear these stories about, quote unquote, the nuns, you know, and I'm going to say I never remember the sisters being mean or nasty. The other thing that I remember is the need for a shopping center. We didn't have a whole lot of shopping opportunities, especially on that side, you know, our side of Route 1, the other side of Route 1. It was always the other side of Route 1. And so Woodbridge did have some, it was a pretty small town. We did have a very nice store called Christensen's. But if you needed something, you know, that Christensen's didn't have, or if you weren't familiar with it because you grew up in East Orange like my mother did, when we went shopping at the beginning of school or Easter or something like that, she would take us, my mother would take us, my sister and me, to Bamberger's in Newark. So we would take the 48 bus from Avenel to Rollway. We would change at the Rollway Theater to another bus, I don't remember the number of that one, and we went into Newark to Market Street and Broad Street, and we would walk the Bambergers. It was an all-day event. We look forward to it every like twice a year. And I have to say that I can't imagine any young woman with 2 young kids doing that today. Another thing that I do remember was people always talked about a need for another hospital other than Perth General Hospital. Hopefully it was going to be a little closer to Avenel. Kennedy Hospital did open in the early 60s, but that's the 60s and not the 50s. So here's the mic.
Thank you. Rawley Hospital will open because it's between New Brunswick. This goes way back to before our time, all of our time up here. But it was halfway between Elizabeth and New Brunswick. So Rawley became the location for a hospital. But Ted's wife, Georgine, worked out of Perth Amboy Hospital. And I don't recall when that hospital opened offhand. But Rawley was the center right next to Avenel. Mm-hmm. But we got the prison. Mm-hmm. Okay, Ted, how about... what was the focal point for you? And probably it was Maple Tree and the farm. Just describe what you guys did for these parties.
Well, I'll tell you, it got hard for me. Saturday and Sundays were booked up for picnics. You can imagine the work that we had to do. Sometimes we had the Knights of Columbus on the front lawn with a picnic going in the back. That's how the business and people came. It was happy times for everybody. They just loved to come to the picnics. And what happened is we had bands coming from New York, great bands, and they brought their own people. They come with 6 buses of dancers, and they would really dance all night. We had General Motors had Linden making the cars. It was turned into being the aircraft for the war effort.
That was Eastern Aircraft.
Right.
Yeah.
And they decided to have a party, actually a picnic for the family that dedicated their time for the war effort of the Second World War. They hired the Maple Tree. 3,000 people showed up. It's a good thing no houses were around. Every field had cars in it. They came in with trucks that brought in the food, the soda. They consumed 27 barrels of beer that day. 27. Can you imagine the people? But they really enjoyed themselves. Today, if you hear of the party that they had down at the Maple Tree, you would say they had such a wonderful time with their family. We not only had a park, we had a baseball field for the kids to play. We had horseshoes. We had stuffed cats that you hit with 3 balls, knocking them down. This is an excitement for the people to do something with the children. They loved to come down to play with the other children. They all became friends between families at that time.
Okay, so what you're saying is that Maple Tree Farm was the center, but it was family workers, and it was families that came. But people come for food. Tell the audience how much the food that you gave to each person. It was in your interview.
Well, for an example, if you had a wedding, at that time you'd get a half a chicken, you'd get potatoes, and then carrots and peas. That was the main dish. Now, during the wartime, we had to grow our own material because everything was rationed. We had 300 pigs. We had 500 chickens that we had to take care of. We slaughtered 2 pigs a week just to have meat for supplying the picnic grove.
Okay, but we're not farmers. Tell us how much these pigs weighed. Because I'm not a farmer. So.
They were 300 pounds, and I'll tell you a little story. The state prison gave us 3 acres of property that we fenced in for the pigs because of the war effort. They gave us 5 acres for a victory garden where we would actually grow tomatoes and everything that you would make soup with. One of the pigs got their nose underneath the fence. 300 pigs were in Avenel project. We got a call from the police department. Anthony, your pigs are in the township. So my father says, let's go. We chased these pigs in and out of the department store. We couldn't even catch one. So my father said, forget it. We got 300. Let's go home. We'll put a stick underneath the fence, hold them up. They'll come back. And sure enough, 4 o'clock. Now this is an open field. They come across in the open field underneath the fence, and then we put it down and nailed it down so it wouldn't happen again. But this is one of the biggest things we had at that time. Yes?
They came back voluntarily? They just came back?
They just came back to themselves. And animals do that. They always come back to eat.
That's amazing.
Yes.
They know where the water is and where they're going to be fed. It's like Joe would come back all day. Barbara would come back all day. Ted, you were always working. But they came back to their houses without cell phones.
When the street lights came on.
When the street lights came on, they knew where they were going to be fed and to sleep. And pigs aren't so stupid, I guess. Okay, we have one more question, then we want to open it up to the public. Biggest changes that you've seen in Avenel. Barbara, we're going to start with you, then we'll go to Ted, then Joe.
Okay.
Wait a minute, Barbara first.
Okay, go ahead.
Okay.
The biggest changes are, I guess, the population, the traffic, and...
Put it right to your mouth.
Okay. I'm really not that familiar with Avenel. Since 1957, been in Hope Lawn more so. But like all areas of the township, it's the population, the traffic, and when I was growing up, Joe spoke about a supermarket. Well, maybe they had one by Remsen Avenue, but we sure didn't have one. We just had a store on Railway Avenue. And
What was the name of the store?
it was owned by,
Kozel
pardon me?
was Mr. and Mrs. Kozel way back when.
I'm talking about one on Railway Avenue.
Andy's food.
There was only a mom and pop store there at that time.
There
The only
were-
thing they had was corn and peas. That's it.
Well, there was a store owned by the Gorski family that carried everything. And I know I had every day, one of my jobs was to go to the store to get the meat that my mother would make for the dinner that night. But I know you asked about a supermarket or whatever. I don't recall a supermarket in Avenel.
Okay. Joe? We're going to have to leave it, open it up to the audience later, but these are memories of a certain time period. Joe, how about you?
So in the 1950s, I do remember a supermarket. It was called ShopRite. It was right on Avenel Street, across the street from School 4 and 5. And I worked there as a kid, and it had a pretty good supply of food. There was another little place on the other side of Route 1 called P&K, which was a smaller, what we would today maybe think of as like a quick check type of place. But the biggest change, I certainly agree, a massive increase in population, change in demographics. The development of any wooded area has been just unbelievable. You know, the mayor was here telling us about more development to take place in town. And that can be, I guess, looked at one way or the other, depending on your perspective. But to have all the woods be turned into those apartment buildings was pretty sad for me. I mean, I had grown up by the time that happened, but it was still kind of sad. Tear downs of buildings, of large buildings, and then constructing apartments. The most recent big development, of course, is the Station Village that the mayor offered. In my opinion, again, I'm going to quote my friend Gary back there, that there was sort of a loss of a privacy, dignity, still emotion, or a presence from Avenel.
Okay, thank you. Ted, you're gonna conclude. Biggest changes, I know you're an Edison resident now, but looking back on Avenel?
Well, looking back, we really had bad times. We had outhouses, we had well waters, and we had dirt roads. When the car came up a dirt road, you had nothing but dust at that time. The changes were made when they had to actually come in, pave the roads to stop the dust. They had to come in with sewer lines. They had to come in with water lines. They had to come in with gas lines. They had to come up with electric poles. There was no electricity at that time. They used kerosene lamps. They used kerosene for cooking. When I went to school, I used to smell like kerosene, and I was very embarrassed about it. But everybody smelled like kerosene, so it didn't have any effect on me. But I didn't realize this at the time. I thought it was just me that stunk. But, things were very important. For an example, the railroad coming through Avenel Street there next to the school. They had to put an underpass in there to keep it safe for the children. That was the main thing in there. I used to cross the railroad myself and look for the trains just to try to get home. You always had a guard there, but you never knew what was coming. The trains came in through fast. They didn't come through fast, and that was a school zone. That underpass was needed for years, and they finally got it done. Now, Avenel, and I think today, still remains a residential neighborhood. I don't think Avenel grew to a point where, this is my impression, that people want to be left alone in Avenel. I don't see the association unless you belong to a church or an organization. People stay to themselves today. You don't have the friendship you had years ago. And I think this is a shame, because everybody should get involved. An example would be if you have children. At that time, everybody watched each other's children. I don't care who they were. And they made sure that they were safe. Today, I think people shut the doors. And you worry about your own children for yourself. That help that is there is no longer. I don't know if it's the fast pace that we are living in today, but it's a shame. People should not get to that point. People should worry about people. This is family. I believe everybody is family.
Okay, thank you. And I think each of our panelists mentioned that strong spirit of community in Avenel. And just looking at the audience, how many of you have come back for just to reminisce? Before we conclude, do any of you have any questions that you want to ask any of the panelists? Okay, now you're going to have to talk very loud or reach across, or just state it, and I will repeat the question for you then.
I just wanted to know when Maple Tree and the dances stopped.
Okay, Ted, that's a Ted question. When did the dances at Maple Tree, the dance pavilion, stop?
When did it close?
What happened? Second World War started. All the young boys.
Use the mic.
All the young boys were taken into the service. Actually, our business went down to just a plain tavern. All the young boys went overseas. Everybody was working for the war effort at that time, and everybody was busy. Everybody put in 100% of their time because of the war effort. We were so happy to see it that time. That's how we won the war. People got together and helped each other. Even during the wartime, they worried about each other going to work. They made sure they were up in the morning. This was the war effort that was keeping us together. It changed when the boys came back from the war, Second World War. They didn't want to live with the families anymore. They were so exhausted from fighting the war, they wanted to travel. They wanted to get out and go across the United States. The car industry grew overnight. People wanted cars just to get away to the beaches, to other states. So this is why our business actually went to zilch. There was nobody around.
All right. So you would say by the 1950s?
Yes.
All right. And then Maple Tree Manor will become the senior citizen housing by the year 2000, I think, because Annie Pachowski and the Pachowski family owned the Maple Tree Tavern. By the 60s, 70s, it was a tavern. And then it became senior housing by the year 2000, I believe. And if you look at the Historic Preservation Commission booklet that's out in the office there, get the booklet on Avenel, and that would have the exact date that you get the senior housing there. But as Ted stated, the business declined rapidly. So much of what we saw after World War II had an impact. The automobile had an impact. Suburbia had an impact because the frames come into Avenel at that time, and you have the new housing. So there's a lot of changes going on. Georgine?
I just want to mention, I remember insurance became a problem too in places like that.
Oh, right.
That was a big problem, that they were, anybody that got hit with a horseshoe or whatever, they would sue Maple Tree.
Okay, let me just rephrase what you're saying. Georgine Pachowski, Ted's wife, mentioned that insurance started coming about after the 50s into the 60s, because I know my parents were in the liquor business. And anything you sold, especially liquor, if there was an accident, then the proprietor could be sued, the business would be sued. And you mentioned if you got hit by a horseshoe, because they had horseshoes, you were subject to this. So insurance had an impact as well. You're right. I forgot about that totally. Okay, any other questions? Yeah, Gary in the back?
Yes, what was your connection with the small dry goods store on Avenel Street that we knew as Mrs. Kuzniak's?
It wasn't Kuzniak, that was Kuzmiak. Yes, no relation whatsoever. And I've been asked that numerous times.
All right, and Ted, for the Maple Tree area, there was also a fishing pond with a walk bridge where Premier Die Casting is now. Do you recall that? We used to fish there all the time from crossing the tracks.
A fishing pond. The pond.
Oh, we had a pond down at the farm, and we had, I guess, 30-foot willow trees used to hang over this pond, and it was almost like air conditioner in the summertime. When I got out of school in the summertime, that's where I spent my time, because the areas were, like I said, was wide open. You never had any friends. You had to do what you did yourself for a vacation during the summertime. My time was spent. I made a boat every year. I used to, when they were building the houses, I used to take the tongue and groove pieces that they dropped off the house, and I would make a 9-foot rowboat just to sit in that water my summertime with my air conditioner. I'll tell you a little funny story that happened. We had a man come into the tavern, and he says, "Can I use the boat to go duck hunting?" I says, "Fine." I helped him put it on his car. This guy goes in the tavern. He's in the tavern. He comes out at 4 o'clock. I used to put tar from the road all in the bottom of the boat to seal it. The tar melted over his car. He got so cold, so mad, he took a shotgun and blew a hole through my boat.
Okay, thank you. Ron, you have a question?
That waterway was the headwaters for the Warway River. One time I filed for fishing and other things. But Premier Broadcasting was a terrible company. It polluted the water. And the last I heard, nothing's living there anymore completely because Premier Broadcasting polluted the water terribly.
All right, we didn't have those environmental laws that didn't come about till 1970, and so much of our waterways have been damaged, but we've started to clean up many of them right now. There is a question in the back. Yes, can you stand up?
I'm going to ask, is Kuzniak, I was going to say, back
Street. Actually, I spent time going with there where she lived, and she turned out to be a very positive person in my life. But we also had Nancy Kuzniak in my high school class in elementary school in Avenel 4 and 5. Are you related to her?
To Nancy?
Nancy?
Pardon?
Are you related to Nancy Kuzniak?
She is my sister.
Oh,
Yes.
I'll talk to you afterwards.
Yeah.
I don't think she comes to, even in the past few years.
She's living in Edison. She has 3 children. She's a grandmother.
I'll talk to you
And
afterwards.
yeah, and she looks exactly like me.
I think you are because you look like her.
Yeah.
okay.
When we were in Avenel School, she wore glasses. I didn't wear glasses till the 6th grade.
Okay, well, thank you. You can see Barbara later. Bruce Christensen.
One further comment. We were talking about the urbanization or suburbanization of the area. Very few woodlands left. Most of you are probably familiar with the Oros Preserve on Omar Avenue. This is in honor of Ernie Oros and the River Watch, and they've done a great job to try to bring back some of this area. Over the last 5 years, I've taken regular bird surveys in that area, and I've seen approximately 110 different species just in that area. Of course, some just come through a migration, but when you think of Woodbridge, you think of Avenel, you don't necessarily think of a wildlife preserve. But this is an area that a lot of people can just enjoy themselves, and thankfully it has been preserved. There is a lake back there, and I was going to ask Ted whether that was the lake that they were hunting ducks in.
I don't know how they filled that in. That used to be a pond for the ducks. You mean across in the state prison?
No, the one that's off of Omar Avenue in the Oros Preserve is a lake back in that section.
It's heading toward the other side of Raway Avenue, heading towards Carteret on Omar Avenue. But you have to realize Ted didn't have much leisure time. You were always working and cutting up the pigs, or you were chasing the cows, whatever. He didn't have much spare time except for the maple tree.
I just want to... When I was going out with my wife, I worked 7 days a week, and I don't know how many hours a day. And my wife's father was going down the shore every weekend. And I said to her, "Doesn't your father ever work?"
Okay, we're going to take one last question, and right over here, and then we can meet afterwards. You want to ask Ted?
Yes. Did you know Margaret Galida?
Oh, yes.
Okay.
Yeah, they were there for years.
Yes.
Yes.
But my first question, did she really have a speakeasy in the basement?
Which one?
Margaret Galida in her big house on the hill.
Oh, I don't know. I couldn't tell you. I
You don't want the mafia coming after you, Ted.
He found the gun and the blackjack, too. Okay, you can meet with him afterwards, okay? And we also have a photograph of the Black Cat nightclub that was in Avenel, and one of the albums that I have out there. All right, so I want to conclude. This was a collaborative effort. I want to thank the Barron Arts, and that's Cynthia Knight, the director, as well as Brandon Powell and Connie, who worked there. I want to thank our 2 docents, Lynn Steinfeld and Carol Rebovich. The Historic Preservation Commission, Bruce is a member, and if you would come up, Bruce, now, just put the camera down. You got to put the camera down and give each of our panelists the Historic Preservation book, okay? These are the notebooks that they're right over there.
Thank you.
These are the Historic Preservation Commission brochures. There's about 9 of them right now. You have some of them out in the other room that you can have there for free. But each of our panelists will receive one. Okay.
Ted, thank you.
Joe?
Thank you
So-
very much for this presentation.
Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you.
And we couldn't have had this. Thank you. We could not have had this without these three panelists, and their memory recall was excellent. So please applaud them because they made this program a success.